Very occasionally, a whole field is dominated by such a deep consensus that it becomes invisible to those who propound it. And it's been rather like that in the social sciences in general, and the sociology of religion in particular, through from the 60s to the 90s. And the consensus, as many of you will know, was that secularization, the process by which religion disappeared as societies modernized, that was inevitable and inexorable, and that's what we were living through in countries like the UK. Since the 1990s, there's been a growing turn against secularization theory and a lot of talk of desecularization and post-secularity. And that leaves us with the question, how are we now to really look at the religious landscape, freed from an obsession about religious decline, and what do we see when we do look? What do we see in terms of religion and secularity, and are those even the appropriate categories through which to look? So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, and to help us do that, we're very fortunate to have Professor Grace Davey, Emeritus at Exeter University.
I want to capture the essence of each post-war decade, concentrating on a key date, capturing a date. The aim is to contextualize the current debate about religion and to emphasize continuity as well as change. The 1960s brought about radical change in both society and the church. Here, for me, the key date is 1969, when the Americans landed on the moon. For me, this represents the height of secular confidence. Man, it was man, can do anything. And note that this is the decade in which the social sciences come of age, underpinned by a markedly secular philosophy of science. This has important consequences for our readings of later religious trends, because social science expects the secular. But in the 1970s, the mood changes, reflecting growing uncertainty, both economic, that's the oil crisis, and cultural. Are we masters of our fate or not? The key date is 1979, Mrs. Thatcher, of course, but much more important, the Iranian Revolution. Because with reference to Iran, note both the reassertion of religious certainty, fundamentalism in that vocabulary, but more important for this tonight, the failure of social science, or indeed anyone else, to anticipate the shift. No one expected a revolution underpinned by conservative readings of Islam. So to the new millennium, the 2000s, in which hopes are dashed very quickly. We have to take 2001, 9/11, as our key date. All of us remember where we were on that fateful day, and we all knew that the world would never be the same again. And at last, some of us are beginning to, by this stage, to appreciate that it might be wise to pay greater attention to the place of religion in the lives of individuals, communities, and societies. I'm going to add an additional date, 2005, which is the death of John Paul II. Who went to the funeral? Everyone, except the Chinese. 4 American presidents, and including from Britain, Prince Charles, the Prime Minister, and the Archbishop. This was unprecedented in British society. So we arrive at the current debate. Is God back, or did God never go away? In my view, both are true. The world is most certainly a very different place, but the revolution regarding religion lies as much in the perception of public commentators as it does in the realities of the modern world.
If you go and look for the religion section of almost any bookshop in Britain these days, you'll find that it's been subsumed under mind, body, spirit. The reason is simple. What we call religion has changed dramatically, particularly, I think, in the last 30 years. I think the change is so significant that we can call it a de-reformation of religion. In other words, the main features which have characterised religion in Britain since the Reformation of the 16th century have given way. For most people, religion has ceased to be a matter of belonging to a clerically led community, affirming dogma, participating in prescribed rituals, and holding conservative social attitudes. It's transformed into something else. Let's start in looking at what's happened with rituals, both national and personal. From the Hillsborough disaster onwards, the Church has gradually ceded control. It still has a role to play, but by the time of Diana's death, that role had become secondary to popular practices and innovations. Similarly, the Church's hold over birth, marriage, and death has weakened dramatically in the last 30 years. Religious belonging, that's transformed as well. It used to be about belonging at the local level and national level. Now it's become a matter of association with like-minded people by way of real and virtual networks which transgress local and national boundaries. So a British Muslim, for example, may associate face-to-face with a few like-minded friends, spend a lot of time reading and chatting on the web, feel part of a global ummah, and long to go on Hajj. And you can say something rather similar about young Catholics, evangelicals, neo-pagans, and others. The statistics on church attendance confirm this. Between 1950 and 1980, church attendance halved. And between 1980 and 2005, it halved again. It's down to 6.3% of the population. We don't want to belong like that anymore. Doesn't mean we're necessarily individualistic, but we associate in different ways. What we believe, that's changed too. Belief in a personal God roughly halved between the 1960s and 2000. From 57% of the population believing in a personal God to 26%. But over exactly the same period, belief in a spirit or life force doubled, from 22% to 44%. So many more people now believe in a spirit, life force than in a personal God. Religion has returned to the core business of sustaining everyday life, supporting relations with the living and the dead, and managing misfortune. That's why angels, cathedrals, pilgrimages and retreats are all doing well, and why mind, body, spirit has taken over in the bookshops. Pulling back the focus to Britain as a whole, what all this means is that the religious landscape has become vastly more diverse. It's misleading now to think of it in terms of 6 world religions or 9 world religions, pre-packaged traditions into which individuals can be subsumed without remainder. The monopolies have broken down. Religious leaders don't have the same authority. Religious identity is more individual, idiosyncratic, more interesting. The tragedy, and I think it really is a tragedy, is that we continue to asphalt over all this change and variety with simplistic understandings of religion rooted in the past and all too often projecting even then some sort of distorted, fundamentalising understanding of what religion is like or was like. The effect is to let religious and secular extremes get away with it, get away with telling us that only dogmatic, conservative, totalising religion is real religion. It isn't. And it's time to stop dwelling on minority extremes at the expense of the middle ground majority, which is to say, most of us.
My work in broadcasting of religion in Britain has given me, I suppose, 12 years at the coalface of religion on TV, and 10 of those commissioning religion for both Channel 4 and the BBC. Religion has been half of my career, the other half centred around news and current affairs. And I didn't study theology, but somehow I found myself shaping how religion is accessed and presented on TV. And if you'll indulge me, it's through this prism of my professional engagement with the subject that I will talk about today. I've been asked hundreds of times by journalists and students if the events of 9/11 made my job easier. Well, the question is, The questioners always point out the numbers of books available on religion post 9/11, the increase in reporting and studying of issues about religion. Now, there's a trouble with this theory, and the big trouble is, as true as it is in general about the upsurge of interest in religion as a whole in the country, it was a good 2 to 3 years later before Channel 4 delivered the award-winning Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber, a film that featured the first interviews on film with failed Palestinian suicide bombers, 3 years before the series Children of Abraham, and a good 5 years after 9/11 before the genre-defining The Cult of the Suicide Bomber, a series which we were just finishing off in the edit suite on that day in July when Mohammed Sadiq Khan and his gang of criminals unleashed all that pain and suffering in London. Now, what happened in those 3 years before Inside the Mind of a Suicide Bomber? Well, Grace puts her finger on it when she refers to low levels of religious literacy, and it's for this reason it probably took 3 years to catch up. If you understand your audiences, then you get it right. You won't get it right for everybody, but understanding them is the key. And if we don't understand these particular trends in religion, whether it be audiences or subject areas, then we'll be in a situation where in the past the genre was very nearly killed by not understanding. Now, Grace and Linda put their finger on the two issues that I, and in fact all of us, must understand. I've talked about literacy, but Linda's point about the new generation who are different to their parents, the professional army, as Grace brilliantly calls them, are what interests me for the future of programming. How do we engage with them? From a Christian point of view, I doubt they're watching Songs of Praise, as our average audience is around about 65. And I'm pretty sure that across all the faiths, this group aren't watching our documentaries in huge numbers either. So where are they getting their information from? Do they want to be served by broadcasters, or do they simply want to talk to themselves? Now, I need to know, as they're a group, I feel we need to serve. We need to bring them into debate without them or us being ill-informed about each other. So I think of all of my output, I think the Sunday morning programme like The Big Questions is more likely to appeal to them. Here they get a voice and a chance to disagree with, as Linda puts it, the traditional mediators of religion. Their opinion on this show is as equal as that of a rabbi or a bishop. The audience profile is very young and it's growing, and I'm not surprised at all because it's one of very few outlets that people have to have this level of kind of conversation.
The old imperial God is dead. Some of us may say good riddance to that because we were never happy with a creed that yoked Christianity to empire and power. If the British are no longer so sure of ourselves, that may not be a bad thing either. What is certain, though, is that we are becoming something new. The nice middle-class Church of England of the post-war years, with its God of the village fete and the Victoria sponge, may have been easy to ridicule, but it also provided a voice of moderation. It has shrunk away. There are still brilliant people, of course, doing brilliant things in the parishes, and indeed they were doing the big society long before Mr. Cameron was in Eton Tales. But as an institution, the C of E no longer has enough money, priests or people to go on fulfilling its historic mission in the same way. So it must find a new way to serve. And the best of its people know this. However, there is no doubt that in terms of perceived importance in our everyday lives, it has shrunk away, which leaves us space. As Linda says, we have a marketplace now in which those who shout loudest and are most certain of their own truths get the most attention. They may be Christians, they may be Muslims, they may be from that strange church of atheism, but they all attract those who are looking for certainty. That's why bishops, and in particular retired archbishops, are drawn more and more towards the same declaration of certainty. If you ask people if they believe in a God of any kind, and you take the lowest survey results around, British Social Attitudes probably is a good one, and strip out all those who belong to a church, temple, mosque, or any other kind of religious grouping, then you end up with something like, well, at least 20 to 26 million men and women in Britain who say yes, they believe in God, but no, they don't belong to anything. Grace was absolutely right and prophetic in writing that and sketching it out, and it's become more true than it ever was. Those people aren't going to church. Some of them, indeed, are watching The Big Questions. These are the people Linda identifies in her work, and theirs is what she calls real religion. A loose, superstitious, idiosyncratic, iconoclastic spirituality, informed not just by the Christianity that still haunts us, as the Archbishop of Canterbury puts it, but by neo-paganism, environmentalism, Buddhism, and the influence of the many gods we now have, instead of one. And I would say, both to broadcasters and to the mainstream leaders of religious groups, that the challenge now actually is to look around and realise that we do have an ad hoc, idiosyncratic, personalised, new national faith. And those people, in their millions, need to be heard.
Andrew Morton from Wales, soon to be an ex-vicar, because I resigned because I thought my institution was going the wrong way. And I thought the only honourable thing was to talk to it from the outside rather than from the inside. But that's not the point. I want to pick up something that Cole Morton said about something that, as religious professionals, we all have and all use, and that is our opportunities to contribute to what might be called rites of passage, in particular, marriages and funerals. It is, let's face it, often the only time and place when people will attend any kind of place of worship.
I want to pick up as well on your point about, death and rituals in general. I'm really fascinated in the way that there's a kind of re-ritualisation of everyday life going on. So we've invented a whole load of new rituals. We're ritually marking every part of life now in a way we didn't before, just since 2001. It's very precise, I think. So if you think now there are rituals around pregnancy, there are naming ceremonies for children, baptism and marriage have got put together. Do the both things together. Have the baby first, then get married. One cake, much cheaper. Yeah. High school proms. Where did they come from? I mean, we didn't have that when I was at school. Marriage. You start with an engagement now. That's become a ritual. You might not get married. Engagement is a ritual in its own right. Marriages have got bigger. Then you can have, if it goes well, you can have a rededication. If not, you have a divorce party. There's a whole lot of paraphernalia now if you Google divorce parties for ritual celebrations of that. And death practices have proliferated and changed. Even, I haven't got time to go into them all, but even if you just look at the practices around the disposal of ashes, first of all, they used to be buried, then scattered in one place. Now you partition them and you do loads and loads of things with them.
Can I just make an important point about that? As a cleric, I cannot be in charge of that kind of service because I'm not allowed to by my institution.
Right.
And I think
right.
that is the institution that's getting it wrong.
Right. So the interesting question is, how do the institutional churches relate to these practices?
Stephen Thames, MP for East Ham. I wanted to ask a question about those who are going to church. Linda made the point the number had halved and halved again. In London, it's been reported that it's now going up. I wonder whether you think the number has sort of plateaued, or is what's happening in London just a blip? And what's the relationship between those people and this much larger group who have a looser faith? Are those people drawing what they believe from the small group, or is the big group sort of self-contained and getting its beliefs from somewhere completely different?
Christianity in this country, there's been a huge internal realignment that's not usually noticed. So if you break down regular church attenders now, less than a third are Anglican, less than a third are Roman Catholic, and more than a third are a mixture of independent, more voluntaristic, Baptist, African, Pentecostal, charismatic. That's the biggest group now. That's a huge shift in the overall profile of Christianity. And part of the reason London's doing well, part of the reason is because of the success of African-derived churches. And churches which attend very much more to the emotional, to everyday concerns, to healing, to some of the same themes that you see in alternative forms of spirituality as well. But part of your question was also, where does religion come from for people now, and how important are the churches still in that? It always used to be assumed by sociologists that you could only get religion one way, and that was from your parents. So religion was handed down the generations. That ceased to be true now. I think that's one really surprising thing that's come through in project after project on our programme. People now learn just as much from their peers. There's a project about young Sikhs and how they learn about the faith. They learn about it in summer camps, Sikh camps. They learn about it in university societies. They learn about it from the web. They still go to the Gurdwara occasionally to worship. It's not irrelevant, but it's a much bigger and broader package. And that's partly why I think that re-ritualisation happened since 2001, the explosion of the internet. and of social media has made a huge change in the way that we learn about our religion.
I think this London situation is extremely interesting because it's right across the denominations that the rise in the church-going can be seen. It's not one denomination at the expense of others. They are all rising. Now again, these social scientists saw 20, 30 years ago that London was leading us downwards, and the rest of us, particularly rural Britain, were the laggards, but we'd get there surely sooner or later. Well, before we finally made it, London's gone up again, which makes me very cautious about predictions. I really do think the jury's out on the next 30, 40 years. We were wrong too often in the 1960s and 70s. We thought liberal Protestantism would be the gainer, and it's turned out to be the loser. It may well turn again. Just on the question of numbers and the minority and the majority, Linda and I debate a little bit about this, but when she says, 6-point-something% in church on Sundays, it's true, but there'll be 6-point-something% in church next Sunday, and they won't be the same people. There is a bigger pool, and this rigorous statistical analysis is not revealing that, and particularly by people who choose to read it otherwise. So I think a little caution there is a good thing. And I knew this professional army business would cause trouble, but it has made you think. Do remember that I've spent most of my professional life looking at the middle, the believers without belongers, trying to understand their vicarious attachment to the institution. I've done my best. And as a member of the Church of England, I know how effective a parish can be if well-led and well-supported. Now, they're not all well-led and well-supported, and some struggle. But if incredible things go on in Church of England parishes, many of them laudable. And what I think is the not all of them. What I think is the greatest challenge to the historic church in this country is how to ensure the best of the parish model when the resources mean that you can't afford it. In a way, you can't afford to do it in the way that you always have done. But that doesn't mean that you give up entirely. There are new creative ways forward. Let's find them.
So I wonder how the panel thinks, how important do they think external media that's external to the UK is important in shaping religious values in Britain? And just to give an example, think about a group like African Pentecostals. Why might they be watching the BBC? Because they can access their religion unadulterated via satellite television.
If we do ask people for a license fee, then in some way we have to give them, something in return. Now, we obviously do in many ways, but for many people who are coming here, what they want, they're never going to get from the BBC, because the BBC is and always will remain a broadcaster. So if they do not want broadcasting and they want narrowcasting, then there's absolutely nothing we can do about that. They want things in their own language, and they want the kind of religious conversation that we can never have, because we don't have that kind of religious conversation in this country in terms of our broadcasting. And there have been channels which have been closed down for that very fact. And because they are doing things which obviously are in breach of Ofcom guidelines. So yes, they have huge impact. On a personal level, I think it's a shame. I think it's a negative impact. I believe that we should all be talking to each other, and I believe there's a place for these, but there needs to be broadcasting, not narrowcasting. And if this narrowcasting continues, it's not going to be, I don't think it's helpful at all for social cohesion.